1968 was unlike any year before or since. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Robert Kennedy was assassinated. Cities burned. Students rioted in Paris. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago turned into a battlefield. American soldiers were dying in Vietnam by the thousands, and in the middle of all of it, some of the most powerful rock music ever made came out of nowhere and somehow said exactly what needed to be said. These are 13 powerful rock songs that captured the spirit of 1968. Number 13, Hello, I Love You by The Doors.
Hello, I love you, won't you tell me your name? Hello.
The Doors released Hello, I Love You in the summer of 1968 as a single from their third album, Waiting for the Sun. The song was written by Jim Morrison, reportedly several years before it was recorded, possibly as early as 1965 when he saw a black woman walking on the beach in Venice, California, and was struck by her. When it finally came out in July 1968, it went straight to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, where it stayed for 2 weeks. In the United Kingdom, it reached number 15.
Hello, I love you, won't you tell me your name? Hello.
Morrison had written hundreds of pages of poetry and filled notebooks with ideas before he channeled any of it into songs. Hello, I Love You was on the simpler, more immediate end of his writing, a direct burst of desire rather than the surrealist and philosophical explorations that dominated The Doors' earlier work. That directness was part of why it hit so fast on radio. The late 1960s had no shortage of cosmic statements and apocalyptic imagery. A song that cut straight through with urgency stood apart precisely because it wasn't trying to be anything other than what it was.
Hello, I love you, let me jump in your game.
The Doors were navigating an increasingly turbulent relationship between their art and the commercial world throughout 1968. Morrison was becoming harder to manage and more prone to confrontation with venues and television producers. The band had been banned from The Ed Sullivan Show the previous year for refusing to change a lyric on the show. They kept recording and kept touring. Hello, I Love You, reaching number 1 in the summer of 1968, placed them, however briefly, at the center of American pop culture even as the world around them was coming apart at the seams.
Hello, I love you, won't you tell me your name? Hello.
Number 12, In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida by Iron Butterfly.
Oh, won't you come with me?
The story behind the title is part of the legend. Doug Ingle, the band's keyboardist and vocalist, had been working on a slow, organ-heavy piece called In the Garden of Eden. When he tried to say the title to drummer Ron Bushy, Ingle was reportedly intoxicated, or the words were simply slurred, and Bushy wrote down what he heard. The garbled phrase stayed. The song was recorded in a single session on May 27, 1968, at Ultrasonic Studios in Hempstead, New York. The full album version ran 17 minutes and 5 seconds and occupied the entire second side of the vinyl record.
Please take my hand.
Iron Butterfly released the album in June 1968 on Atco Records. The album went to number 4 on the Billboard Albums chart and spent 140 weeks on the chart, 81 of them in the top 10. A shortened single version, reduced to just under 3 minutes, was released in July 1968 and climbed to number 30 on the Hot 100. The contrast between those two numbers captures something true about how the song lived in the culture. On radio, the edited version was a modest hit. On the turntable, in a darkened room with the full 17-minute experience, it was something else entirely.
In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida, don't you know?
The album sold over 4 million copies in the United States alone. It became one of the best-selling records in Atlantic Records history to that point. Musicians who were there at the time have since described how In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida seemed to define a particular quality of 1968. The feeling that rock had moved somewhere nobody had expected, that it had gotten heavier and stranger and more demanding of the listener's patience and attention. Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin, and others who came after have acknowledged its influence. What began as a slurred song title became the name of something that genuinely changed the language of rock music.
Oh, won't you come with me?
Number 11, Piece of My Heart by Big Brother and the Holding Company featuring Janis Joplin. Big Brother and the Holding Company had been playing the San Francisco ballroom circuit for a couple of years, Before Janis Joplin stepped in front of their microphone at the Monterey Pop Festival in June 1967 and made everyone forget there was a band behind her. Piece of My Heart was the song that carried her to a national audience. It appeared on the band's major label debut, Cheap Thrills, released in August 1968 on Columbia Records. The song reached number 12 on the Billboard Hot 100. The original version of Piece of My Heart had been recorded by Irma Franklin, Aretha Franklin's older sister, in 1967. The song was written by Jerry Ragavoy and Burt Burns. Irma Franklin's version charted but didn't break through. What Joplin did with the same song was transform it from a controlled soul performance into something raw and barely contained. She wasn't covering the song so much as inhabiting it in a way that made the pain in the lyric feel immediate and visceral. Cheap Thrills went to number 1 on the Billboard Albums chart and stayed there for 8 weeks. The cover art, a comic strip designed by Robert Crumb, was one of the most visually distinctive album covers of the era. Columbia had wanted a more traditional cover, but the band preferred Crumb's work. It became one of the most recognizable images of the 1960s. Joplin left Big Brother before the year was out, feeling she had outgrown the band and needed musicians with different technical foundations. Her departure was difficult for everyone involved, but the record she made with them in 1968 ensured that her name and the song would stay connected to each other for as long as rock music is remembered. Number 10, The Weight by the band. The band released their debut album, Music from Big Pink, on July 1st, 1968. They had spent the previous 2 years as Bob Dylan's backing group, touring with him through his controversial Electric Era, and before that as the Hawks, a Canadian bar band that had played the roughest rooms in North America for years. By the time they recorded their own record, they had something rare, a group of musicians who had been playing together long enough to sound like a single organism. The Weight peaked at number 63 on the Billboard Hot 100, which does not begin to suggest what the song did to the people who heard it. The album peaked at number 30 on the Pop Albums chart. Modest numbers for one of the most celebrated records in rock history. What happened instead was that musicians heard it and responded as if to something fundamental. Eric Clapton cited it as what convinced him to leave Cream. Roger Waters said it was the most influential rock record behind the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. George Harrison spoke about it in similarly reverential terms. The Weight was written by guitarist Robbie Robertson and sung primarily by drummer Levon Helm. It tells the story of a traveler arriving in a town called Nazareth and encountering a series of people who each place a burden on him before he can move on. The song's emotional center is Helm's voice, gravelly, southern, worn in a way that felt completely at odds with the polished studio productions that dominated the charts in 1968. At a moment when rock was going in a dozen different directions at once, the band seemed to be stepping backward towards something older, more rooted, more patient. That feeling was exactly what many listeners needed, even if they couldn't have said so in advance.
Take a load off Fanny. Take a load for free.
Number 9, Street Fighting Man by the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones released Street Fighting Man in August 1968, and the timing made the song feel dangerous in ways its authors may not have fully anticipated. The song arrived in the immediate aftermath of violent confrontations between police and protesters at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Several American radio stations refused to play it, fearing it would incite unrest. In Chicago itself, some stations banned it specifically, citing the ongoing civil tensions in the city. The Stones had spent most of 1967 in legal trouble, drug arrests, court appearances, Jagger's brief imprisonment and release, and had released their Satanic Majesty's Request, a psychedelic experiment that disappointed many of their fans and critics. Street Fighting Man was the opening shot of their recovery. Written by Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, it appeared on Beggar's Banquet, which the band released in December of 1968. The album was a return to blues-based rock, and it announced a darker, more menacing version of the Rolling Stones, that would carry through Let It Bleed and Exile on Main Street in the years to come. Jagger later said that the song was not a literal call to violence, but a commentary on the limitations of what a rock musician could actually do in the face of political upheaval. He described feeling the frustration of watching the world change around him while his only available weapon was a guitar. That tension between the urgency of the moment and the relative powerlessness of a songwriter runs through the song and gives it a restless, unsettled quality that matched where many people were in the summer and fall of 1968. Number 8. People Got to Be Free by The Rascals. People Got to Be Free by The Rascals reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in the summer of 1968 and stayed there for 5 weeks, making it one of the biggest hits of the entire year. It was written by Felix Cavaliere and Eddie Brigati between the 2 assassinations of that spring. After Martin Luther King Jr. was killed in April and before Robert Kennedy was shot in June. The song's message of tolerance and brotherhood was born directly out of that specific window of grief. The Rascals, previously known as the Young Rascals, had built their reputation on blue-eyed soul and R&B, recording hits in a style that owed much to the Black American music they admired. By 1968, the band had become more explicitly political. They announced at several concert venues that they would only perform if a black act also appeared on the bill, at a time when that kind of demand cost them bookings and attention. People Got to Be Free was a commercial song with a genuine political commitment behind it, and audiences received it accordingly. The song was also the song that kept Born to Be Wild by Steppenwolf from reaching number 1. For 3 consecutive weeks, it blocked Steppenwolf from the top of the chart. That detail captures something about where the country was in the summer of 1968, a song about freedom and brotherhood, and a song about freedom and the open road, competing for the same audience at the same moment in the same turbulent summer. Number 7. Revolution by the Beatles. The Beatles released Revolution in August 1968 as the B-side to Hey Jude. Despite being on the flip side, it became one of the most discussed songs the band ever recorded. John Lennon wrote it in response to the political upheaval he was watching. The student protests in Paris and across Europe, the anti-war movement in the United States, the general atmosphere of political confrontation that defined 1968. He wanted to say something about it, but on his own terms rather than aligning with any specific faction. The version released as the single was faster and harder than the slower take recorded for the White Album. Both versions carried Lennon's central statement that he sympathized with the spirit of change but was skeptical of destruction and demanded clarity about what the revolutionaries actually wanted. It was a complicated position that satisfied almost nobody at the political extremes. Some activists felt the song was a betrayal. Some conservatives felt it was too sympathetic to the protesters. The single reached number 12 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 11 in the United Kingdom. The political response was louder than the chart position suggested. Ramparts magazine published an open letter demanding that Lennon recant the song's hesitations. He didn't. He spent much of the rest of his career following the same restless, questioning approach to politics, rarely aligning completely, always asking questions that others found inconvenient. Number 6. Helter Skelter by the Beatles. The Beatles released Helter Skelter on the double album known as The White Album in November 1968. Paul McCartney wrote the song in response to a review he had read that described The Who's I Can See for Miles as the loudest, most cacophonous thing The Who had ever recorded. McCartney decided to write something that would outdo it. He pushed the band to play louder and harder than they had before, encouraging the musicians to keep going until their fingers and throats gave out. The result did not sound like the Beatles. It was distorted, screaming, raw, closer to what would be called heavy metal in just a few years than anything in their catalog to that point. Ringo Starr's famous shout at the end of the track, announcing that he had developed blisters, was kept in the final version deliberately. It was a document of physical effort rather than studio polish. The song was later connected to the Manson family murders when Charles Manson cited it as part of his apocalyptic mythology. The Beatles had no connection to Manson, and the song's meaning had nothing to do with what he attributed to it. The association persisted, but the song carried alongside that shadow its genuine historical significance as a marker of where rock was heading, harder, heavier, further from pop, in the final months of 1968. Number 5, White Room Hahan by Cream. Cream released White Room as a single in October 1968, and it reached number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100. It came from their third album, Wheels of Fire, a double record that combined studio recordings with a live disc capturing the band in concert. White Room appeared on the studio half. Written by Jack Bruce and poet Pete Brown, the song's strange, imagistic lyrics about a person adrift in a relationship that has lost its warmth were set against a musical arrangement that was ambitious, even by Cream standards. Eric Clapton played a wah-wah pedal through most of the lead guitar work on the track, a technique that was relatively new in rock music at the time, and that Clapton used with a restraint and precision that made it sound like a voice rather than a gimmick. The opening riff was one of the most immediately recognizable moments of 1968, and it demonstrated the band's ability to build complexity from a single, recurring musical phrase. Jack Bruce's vocals carried an emotional weight that matched the grief and displacement in the lyrics, without explaining them too directly. Cream would disband before the end of 1969. The pressures of relentless touring, personal tensions, and their collective exhaustion with being one of the biggest bands in the world proved too much to sustain. White Room arrived near the end of the band's commercial peak, and there is something in the song's tone, beautiful, melancholy, slightly out of reach, that captured the feeling of something extraordinary already in the process of ending. Number 4, Sympathy for the Devil by the Rolling Stones.
Be damn sure that Pilate washed his hands.
Sympathy for the Devil opens Beggar's Banquet, the Rolling Stones album released in December 1968, and announces the record's intentions in the first minute of music. The song was written by Mick Jagger, who drew heavily on Mikhail Bulgakov's novel The Master and Margarita, a Soviet-era satirical fantasy in which the devil visits Moscow, and on his own reading of history. Keith Richards contributed the shift from the song's original folk structure to the samba-driven rhythm that drives the final recording. The recording session was filmed by director Jean-Luc Godard for a documentary called 1+1, later released as Sympathy for the Devil. The footage shows the Stones building the track over the course of an evening, the arrangement evolving as they work. The finished performance featured layers of congas, building backing vocals, and Richards' guitar work arriving near the end like something finally released from pressure. Producer Jimmy Miller kept the band disciplined through a session that might otherwise have sprawled. Jagger later said that the song was intended to make people examine their own assumptions about good and evil, that by placing major historical atrocities in the devil's account, the song was asking listeners to consider how those events had been possible and who was responsible. The song was not released as a single in the United States, but it became one of the most discussed tracks of the entire decade and has consistently ranked among the Rolling Stones' most enduring recordings.
Be damn sure that Pilate washed his hands.
Number 3, All Along the Watchtower by the Jimi Hendrix Experience.
Some kind of way out of here.
Bob Dylan wrote All Along the Watchtower and released it on his John Wesley Harding album in December 1967. Jimi Hendrix heard it, recorded his version in January 1968, and released it that September. Dylan later said that when he heard what Hendrix had done with the song, he started performing it the way Hendrix had played it, rather than the way he had originally written it. That is one musician's highest possible acknowledgement of another musician's interpretation. Hendrix's version was recorded at Olympic Studios in London with his Experience, bassist Noel Redding and drummer Mitch Mitchell, and appeared on the Electric Ladyland album released in October 1968. The single reached number 20 on the Billboard Hot 100 in the United States and number 5 in the United Kingdom. Hendrix played multiple guitar parts on the recording, overdubbing rhythm and lead lines that created a density of sound unusual even by the studio standards of 1968. The song built from a relatively quiet acoustic opening to the explosive final section where Hendrix's slide guitar work, using a Zippo lighter as a slide in some accounts, created a sound that had no precedent in rock music. The Electric Ladyland album was Hendrix's most ambitious and most commercially successful record, reaching #1 in both the United States and the United Kingdom. Among the many remarkable performances it contained, All Along the Watchtower was the one that seemed to grow larger over time, a recording that became more significant with each passing decade rather than receding into its historical context.
Some kind of way out of here. Say that.
Number 2, Born to Be Wild by Steppenwolf. Steppenwolf released Born to Be Wild in the summer of 1968, and it climbed to number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100, kept from number 1 by the Rascals' People Got to Be Free. The song was written by Mars Bonfire, the brother of Steppenwolf's drummer, who had originally conceived it as a slower ballad before the band transformed it into the charging, riff-driven anthem the world knows.
Born to be wild.
Within the lyric is the phrase heavy metal thunder, used to describe the sound of a motorcycle engine, which marks the first use of the term heavy metal anywhere in rock music. It was not being used to describe a musical genre. That came later, but the phrase arrived in the same year that the heaviest records of the era were being recorded, and its proximity to that sonic shift gave it a meaning that accumulated over time. The song was used the following year in the 1969 film Easy Rider, where Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper ride into the opening credits as the song plays. The film became a landmark of American cinema and cemented Born to Be Wild as the definitive statement of a particular kind of freedom. Open roads, no obligations, the country stretching out ahead of you, that the late 1960s romanticized and mourned simultaneously. In 2018, the song was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in the category for singles. More than 50 years after its release, it remains one of the most recognizable opening riffs in the history of rock music. Number 1, Jumpin' Jack Flash by the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones released Jumpin' Jack Flash in May 1968, and it went to number 1 in the United Kingdom. In the United States, it reached number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100. After the misfire of their Satanic Majesty's Request, a psychedelic album that many felt had been made under the wrong influences for the wrong reasons, the Rolling Stones needed to remind people who they actually were. Jumpin' Jack Flash did it in 3.5 minutes. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards wrote it at Richards' country house, Redlands, where they had been spending time following the drug charges that had upended their lives in 1967. The song emerged from a creative session that both of them later described as a return to basics, to the blues and rock and roll that had made them want to play music in the first place. Producer Jimmy Miller, who was new to working with the Stones, helped them capture what they were reaching for. The recording used open-tuned acoustic guitars tracked through amplifiers to create a sound that was simultaneously rough and precise. By May 1968, the Rolling Stones had been a working band for 6 years. They had survived the British invasion, the psychedelic era, a drug trial, the death of Brian Jones's ambitions, if not yet of Jones himself, and the pressure of being measured against the Beatles at every turn. Jumpin' Jack Flash was their answer to all of it. Lean, focused, ferocious, and completely confident. The song preceded Beggar's Banquet by 6 months, but established the tone of everything the Stones would record through the end of the decade and beyond. In a year when everything was breaking apart, the Rolling Stones put out the most alive rock and roll record of 1968 and didn't look back. 1968 is impossible to fully understand from the outside. You had to be there, listening to these songs on a transistor radio or a turntable, watching the news every night, wondering what country you were going to live in by the end of the year. But the music those artists made has kept the feeling of that year alive in ways that history books can't quite replicate. These songs still carry the weight of what 1968 felt like, The urgency, the anger, the beauty, and the sense that everything was at stake. If this brought back some memories, leave a like and let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more videos like this one, subscribe and stick around.